In other words, they cast a shadow. There is evidence of them when we backlight the shroud. You can also see evidence that the burn marks, even very light scorches, also cast a shadow. Even the watermarks from the 1532 fire cast a shadow. Behind the burn-throughs, where the patches are, you can see the edges of the shroud where it is actually scorched. However, you'll notice that the image itself, the image of the body, is virtually non-existent. In other words, it doesn't cast a shadow. The conclusion we make then as scientists is that there is no matter, no chemistry, no pigment, particles, dyes, or powders that are in the fibers themselves responsible for the image. In fact, there is nothing in the fibers or in the threads responsible for the image. For if it were there, it would cast a shadow, as everything else you've seen does, even the minute chemicals in the water stains. So therefore, there is no known pigment, particle, dye, or powder that can be seen with the naked eye on the shroud. And also, the shroud is definitely a superficial, that is, surface-only phenomenon. Beyond that lies a host of other areas, beginning with three-dimensionality. So let's move to that. Perhaps the most misunderstood and undervalued aspect of the Shroud of Turin is its three-dimensional characteristic. Most people do not understand it, nor do they understand how we derive that information, nor the significance of the fact that it is totally unique in terms of artifacts or in terms of images, for that matter. The three-dimensionality was derived using a spin-off of space technology called a VP8 image analyzer. If you will, think of it as a TV camera, a standard TV screen, a mini computer which converts signals, and a three-dimensional screen. And what we do is to place an image of the shroud under the camera, feed that signal through the computer and onto the three-dimensional screen. What we get when we place the face of the shroud under the three-dimensional screen is what you're seeing here. You can clearly see the eyebrows, the bridge of the nose, the cheekbones where one is bruised more than the other, the lips and mustache, the beard, the hair, even sort of a strange box in the center of the forehead. Now that is an absolutely unique quality, because if I took your picture with the best 35mm camera money can buy and fed it under the VP8, the face would come out distorted, it would be flat, certain areas would be sunken, others would be raised. It wouldn't look anything like yourself, because a camera has no way to encode distance information that the subject is away from the camera lens. Somehow, the shroud in fact does this. And it does it over the entire body. For example, rather faint images such as the fingers and the wrists and the forearms show up very clearly on the three-dimensional image. In addition, the pectoral muscles of the chest can be seen, the swelling of the abdomen, one knee slightly raised where the body is still in rigor mortis. All these things show up on the shroud. And what it does is it gives us more or less an acid test as to how the shroud might have been made. For example, we can now take any theory of image formation, and if it does not or cannot produce a three-dimensional quality, then we can absolutely reject it. For this reason, we can conclude then that a painted forgery is impossible. As John Jackson put it,
when I first saw this image, I think I knew how Secunda Pia must have felt when, in 1898, he saw his photographic image. As scientists, we believed that it would be practically impossible for a forger, much less a medieval one, to have produced an image like this.
As a matter of fact, we can almost conclude, at least for now, that natural chemistry as we know it cannot explain the three-dimensional characteristic. For if we took a body and put it into a cloth with chemicals or sweat or blood and tried to recreate an image, we would get an image that was badly distorted at best. Even a heated statue has been suggested, but even it fails the three-dimensionality test. So the three-dimensionality then is a very important and totally unique characteristic. The next step was to take that three-dimensional information and translate it into something that our viewers could see and appreciate and understand. In order to do this, we connected our equipment to an electric pencil, an XY plotter. We traced the image down through the body, cut it out with jigsaws on cardboard, and stacked it up into a statue. The result is fairly impressive. Let's have a look. What we're looking at is a fiberglass mock-up of the original cardboard three-dimensional statue created while we were at the Air Force Academy doing this early research into three-dimensionality. It is, in every detail, similar to the Man of the Shroud. It shows one knee slightly raised where the body is still in rigor mortis. It shows things like the unusual box in the forehead. And it is clearly three-dimensional. In fact, if there is any area of three-dimensional research that needs further data, it is an ability to reduce any cloth distortion or drape distortions caused by a body in cloth. And we'll discuss that next. Due to some of the minor distortions in the three-dimensional data, we needed a way to correctly analyze what occurred to the body underneath the cloth. For instance, we had to understand better cloth drape curve. We had to know specifically where the points on the body touched the cloth, which points were in essence then a ridgeline on the cloth. In order to do this, we went to a biostereometrics lab. If you want to look at it this way, a biological lab where we can take different measurements. And using a volunteer who served as a model, some of them used to be friends of ours. How would you like it if we showed you all over America in your BVDs? We draped those bodies with mock-ups traced to scale of the shroud, blood, stains, body images, fire damage areas, and even included on the models such things that might be present on the shroud itself. For instance, obviously the Man of the Shroud has a beard. There is something resting in the forehead. It was suggested that that might be a phylactery, a little leather box containing a portion of scripture. There are possibly coins on the eyes. These things we included in our biostereometric evaluation. We also learned that the distribution of the weight from the dorsal image of the Man of the Shroud is identical to what we would be expecting from a human body on a flat surface. Once we then draped the body completely, we were able to take measurements, and from those measurements reduce the amount of distortion caused by improper cloth drape. And once we reduce that distortion, we hope to be able to reproduce an even better and more accurate three-dimensional image, once again demonstrating to everyone that the shroud is in fact three-dimensionally accurate. Perhaps some of the most significant work on the shroud included microscopic photography, otherwise known as photomicroscopy. A Swiss criminologist and botanist, Dr. Max Frey, who was the head of the European police forces, or equivalent to the FBI, had noted in an earlier research that there were pollen samples on the shroud. In fact, those pollen traces matched the earlier history that we spoke about. Dr. Max Frey concluded on the strength of the analysis of the pollens that at some time in its history, the shroud was in Turkey, where we found the Odessan image. He also concluded
the presence of such a significant number of pollens from plants growing exclusively in the land of the Bible and the surrounding deserts permits only one conclusion, that in some time of its history the shroud was exposed to the open air in Palestine.
Because of such work as the late Dr. Frey's, we wanted to analyze for ourselves some of the close-in microscopic work. Dr. Ray Rogers from the Los Alamos Weapons Lab in New Mexico was able to secure a special pure cellulose tape to remove particles for chemical analysis in this country. We were also able to do some fairly close microscopic photographs. And at these levels of magnification, we were able to discover some fairly significant things. For instance, over the image areas, such as here in the right eye or here in the nose, we see no evidence of pigment, powder, dye, or any artificial particle that would be induced by a human hand if in fact the shroud were a painted forgery. In the image of the nose area, we can actually see some particles of dirt embedded along the fibers of the threads, but these are indicative of the fact that the nose was dirty. And if, in fact, the evidence suggests the man had fallen, we would expect to see dirt in that area. There is also in the area of a blood and image area, this one from the wound in the side, we can see blood particles down between the fibers of the threads, caked along the fibers, and running along them like a fence line. If this were a forgery, again, the pigments, powders, dyes, particles would do the same thing. They would pack along the fibers. They would go down between the fibers of the threads. What we do see, such as in this image fiber, right here in the center of your screen, the image is strictly a sheen or a discoloration, if you will, of the upper curved surface of the fibers of the threads. Technically speaking, the image is linen, cellulose fiber that has been degraded, aged, some say scorched, in an area dissimilar from the rest of the image on the shroud. In order to conduct the research on the Shroud of Turin Research Project had to construct a specially designed table to hold the shroud without stretching it or damaging it in any fashion. The table behind me was constructed at a cost of over $25,000 to the project. It held the cloth in place by the use of special polymer-coated magnets, bar magnets along the frame that would not damage the cloth in any way. This was just a microcosm of the project itself, which included some 7 tons of equipment and 40 men working for years with hundreds of thousands of man-hours of effort. As we conducted the research, the platform was rotatable to horizontal, vertical positions, or even a slant position to allow electromagnetic spectrum, all types of photographs. And the back of the platform had removable panels so that we could study the support cloth stitched on after the 1532 fire. This gave us total access to the cloth and provided an excellent base for which to conduct the research. What then were the conclusions of the Shroud of Turin Research Project? The scientists concluded that the blood was blood, and more importantly, human blood. That the image was dehydrated cellulose, linen that had somehow dehydrated or aged more so than the background linen. They concluded that the image was strictly a surface phenomenon, that it had no directionality to it, that it went no deeper than 2 to 4 fibrils into the fabric. They concluded that there were no artificial pigments, paints, dyes associated with it, that it was chemically stable, thermally stable, that is, stable in areas of heat or fire damage, and stable in areas of water migration where water had flowed through the cloth at some point in its history. They also concluded that this was the image of a crucified human being. They ended by saying that at this point in time, there is no technologically feasible explanation for the image on the Shroud of Turin. Perhaps you have an idea. When we consider the shroud, it has to be in its totality. There's no way to isolate one characteristic, one facet, one area of research. It must be as a whole. Because the entire picture of the shroud is what gives you the overwhelming weight of evidence for authenticity. New Testament scholar John A.T. Robinson, who is perhaps considered to be one of the all-time great Christian skeptics, put it this way.
The more one went into it, the more one realized there was so much about this thing that a forger would never really have thought of, and indeed that he would come up, I think, with a very different cloth from the one we now have.
In fact, for someone of his caliber, it's rather fascinating to note that if we take where he began, which was at a point to try to disprove the shroud from the New Testament evidence alone, that he then concludes in this fashion.
Well, having looked at all the evidence you and I have just seen and tried to assess it as carefully as I can, all I can say is that for me, at any rate, the burden of proof has shifted.
How on earth was the image formed? That truly is the biggest question of all. You know, it's fascinating that after more than 3 years of detailed analysis of the technical results, the scientists concluded that there was no technologically feasible explanation for the shroud at this point, end quote. I'm fascinated that, as a Christian, though I don't need the shroud,